Hello and welcome back to Dolby Creator Talks. I'm Ben Givarz. This is a show about how creatives use technology to tell their stories, and my guests today are Mix engineers Mick Guzauski and Robert Guzman, who join me to explore the Dolby Atmos mixes of Daft Punk's fourth and final studio album, Random Access Memories, a chart-topping record upon its 2013 stereo release, which won 5 Grammys, including Album of the Year, Best Dance Electronica Album, and Best Engineered Album Non-Classical, with Mick at the boards. It's a record Rolling Stone ranks among their 500 greatest albums of all time and features guests such as Giorgio Moroder, Nile Rodgers, Chili Gonzalez, Julian Casablancas, and Pharrell Williams, among others. Mick Guzauski, winner of 9 Grammy Awards, including, as mentioned for this record, has mixed for the likes of Earth, Wind & Fire, Prince, the Bee Gees, Mariah Carey, and so many more. And he is joined by mix engineer Robert Guzman of Studio DMI in Las Vegas, owned and operated by Luca Predolesi, and home to Dolby Atmos mixes for the likes of Skrillex, Diplo, and Drake, to unpack the Dolby Atmos mixes for this record's 10th anniversary edition. So Mick takes us into the studio for the original recording and production and shares how he and Robert used the power of Dolby Atmos to take this modern classic to all new sonic heights. Here's reimagining in Dolby Atmos the modern classic Daft Punk, Random Access Memories. Enjoy. We're really excited to explore this modern classic, really, by Daft Punk with you both. Mick, we'll get into the background and the process around the original record and then into working with Robert and the great Studio DMI team to create the Dolby Atmos mixes. But if we could start with you, Mick, I mean, you've got such a deep background in engineering and mixing going back many years. I mean, to name just a few of the all-time greats that you've mixed: Michael Jackson, Prince, Earth, Wind & Fire, George Benson, Mariah Carey, Eric Clapton, Celine Dion, the list goes on. You've been deservedly recognized with multiple Grammys and various awards, but can you share a little about your early days coming up through the industry and studios and maybe some of the projects that helped shape your workflow and style that would precede the work that you did with Daft Punk?
Before I did this professionally, I was interested in it when I was a kid in engineering, and this was back in the late 1960s. See, I'm a real old fart. I'm like, so I started out with a little studio in my parents' basement in Rochester, New York. And this was before there was any decent home studio equipment. I had to use hi-fi equipment. And actually I started out with two-track machines and a couple mixers and, did tracks, or recorded tracks on the machine, copied it to the other ones while overdubbing vocals. It was very, very, it was fascinating to me, but it was very, very primitive at the time I was doing it. Then I got a multi-track machine and then built up from there. Ended up having another studio in Rochester with a few other guys, did mostly demos and commercials. This was in the early 1970s. And I hooked up with Chuck Mangione, who was an artist. He was from Rochester, and he was just starting to be successful. And I was doing, mixing his sound on the road and doing some sessions. And when he signed with A&M, he brought me to LA with him to engineer the records. And actually, so he just asked, well, I was never out of a little demo studio in Rochester. That was, and so he said, hey, you think you can handle it? If you do, come and do this. And of course, I wasn't going to say no to the opportunity. So my first actually engineering and mixing sessions were at A&M Studios in 1975. It was an album that Chuck did called Chase the Clouds Away. And it was in Studio A there, live rhythm section, string section, brass, woodwinds, the whole works, 40-piece orchestra, all live. And that was my trial by fire. And I guess it worked out. I kept, and a lot of the engineers at A&M at the time, who I met, who were incredible, like really, really helped out, gave me advice, and were very supportive. So it was really a great experience. That's how I got into it. I moved, that was in 1975, and then I finally moved to LA in 1978, and the whole thing with Chuck sort of fell apart, in around 1980, 79, 80, and but I already met a few people and were on a few sessions there, and just sort of worked my way up and hooked up with Earth, Wind, and Fire. Worked for them for a few years, and that was a great experience. I think that probably helped my career more than anything. I mean, not just as far as getting calls, but I mean as far as learning from those guys and learning how to make records. I mean, they had, before I was involved, they had I think one of the best engineers in the world with them, George Massenberg, who stopped doing the sessions because he was involved in designing and building consoles and his automation system at the time. But I mean, having him being around and everything, there's just been so lucky to be with incredible people my whole career, and it just went from there.
You've been coast to coast. You've been in some amazing studios, had some amazing mentors, and worked with some absolutely all-time legendary artists that, represent a lot of different genres, but, a lot of funk and soul and disco and rock. And, if we fast forward a bit, I suppose, to sort of the 2008 era and the beginnings of this record, the Daft Punk guys, Thomas Balkanger and Guy Manuel Deo Mem Cristo, were looking to create an album that reflected on a lot of the sounds that you had been involved in, right? And the aesthetics of the late 70s and the early 80s, drawing on inspiration from those genres. And they were sort of looking to capture the essence of live recording and the feel of these older productions. And it's interesting because they were kind of coming off of two albums that were a little retro leaning, right? But like definitely, electronic house and club records, if you will, with a dance floor sort of flavor. So when that happens in 2008, sort of like, where were you based and what were you working on at that time?
Well, 2008, I didn't even know about the project. I mean, they were starting writing then. And where was I in 2008? I lived in New York then. So I moved from Rochester, New York to LA, then back near New York City after the Northridge earthquake. And my wife wanted to get out of LA after that. She was sort of freaked out. I was out of town working when it happened. So anyways, at that time, I really had a nice offer from Sony, from Tommy Mottola, directly when he ran the company. So we moved to New York in '94. And I worked a lot on Sony projects, Mariah Carey, Michael Bolton, Celine Dion, a bunch of stuff for Sony, and lived in New York from '94 to just after we recorded the Daft Punk album. I went back to LA. And actually, I got involved with them in 2011. Keyboard player and co-writer on some of the songs, Chris Caswell, his name is. We go back to the 60s and 70s in Rochester, and they were looking for a guy to engineer who was through all that, that era of production and projects. So Chris recommended me, and we had a meeting, and I got the gig. We tracked starting in 2011. Tracked live band for a couple weeks, then went back for a couple weeks. They spent probably a good year on editing and their production before we went back and mixed. So I was involved in most of the live recording, basic tracks, a lot of the live musician overdubs, the orchestra overdubs over at Capitol, and pretty much everything I was involved in except for the orchestra, which we did at Capitol, we did at Conway Studios. Which I got to say is my favorite studio in LA, probably in the world, actually. The place is great. So I don't know how much you want to get into the technical aspect.
Yeah, please share as much as you'd like. Absolutely. Okay. I mean, I'm curious about how long the recording took and like some of the processes and procedures.
They wanted to record everything very, very dry, very little room sound, because they wanted to go for that older disco kind of feel. Also, I figured at the time that I wanted the capability of using the room. We were in their Studio C, the big room there. It's a really nice room. So we pretty much tightly baffled off the drums, other instruments, but left the opening in the baffles, and had room mics too. So which really became useful in the album, and also especially in the Atmos mix. So pretty much mic'd the session with the idea of being able to use the room, but having isolation that for when we needed it tight, we needed it tight. I just didn't, when we started tracking, I didn't know where it was going to go. They knew, they had a really good idea, but I was like, I just sort of wanted to be ready for any possibility. A lot of the miking, a lot of what we recorded, I was sort of thinking in the back of my head that, hey, maybe this thing is going to be done in 5.1 at some point. So I sort of just had a little bit of inkling that there may be some surround involved. So I wanted to lay the tracks for that, especially the orchestra. Tracking was done. We used it was done to Pro Tools at 96 kilohertz, and also some of the tracks were done to an analog machine, the Studio 24 track. Actually, bust directly to Pro Tools from the console, then bust to the 24 track, and then the repro had repro out of the 24 track back to Pro Tools, and then after the session just dragged it, that 100 milliseconds or what in sync. So they had the choice. They wanted to have the choice of running an analog and digital in the tracking. So this was just the basic tracks that were done like that. Couldn't use both simultaneously because just the little, even though we did drag it right in sync, the little bit of flutter and anomalies from the analog machine, we couldn't have perfect phase. So for the drums, it was either digital or analog. And in most cases, use the direct to digital tracks. I think the couple, I couldn't tell you exactly what, because they did all the editing after, they took this back to France and did all the post-production on it as far as editing. Then all the overdubs were pretty much done directly to Pro Tools. Used a Neve 88R console. We used some external preamps. They have a nice 88R at Conway. It has discrete mic preamps out in the studio that are controlled from the console, and then the line level is sent. So a lot of the tracks were done through those. Then we used some Neve 1073 modules for overdubs and for some of the tracking, and used API preamps and EQs for the kick and snare. I just always really liked those. That's tight, punchy kind of sound. So that was it. We pretty much had they were self-financed and not concerned at all about budget, so we could do anything we wanted. And so after the tracking and orchestra overdubs, and then I worked on some of the overdubs, they went back and worked a long time on editing, and then we came back and did some overdubs to the edited tracks. And then when it came time to mix, we're in the same room that we tracked at Conway, and they had we had a monitor feed going to one of the ISO booths in the studio, and they had a Pro Tools rig there. So as I was mixing, if they heard stuff they wanted to change in the arrangement or performance, they could do it right there and send me the track. So it was very interactive and collaborative with them when we were doing this, when we were mixing the album. Also, they wanted to mix to analog. They're very experimental. I mean, they really like to look at every aspect, every possibility. And we mixed to 3 analog half-inch machines. They're all Ampex ATRs. 2 of them were running at 30 amps on half-inch tape, one using a stock ATR 102, and the other one was an ATR 102 with ATR's high fluxivity heads. And then the third one was Aria Electronics, and it was running at 15 amps. And we printed everything to all 3 machines 3 times. First time was had the output level of the console where I felt it was hitting the tape just right, and then we went up a dB and a half, 2 dB, and then down a little. So they had the choice of different amounts of saturation, of tape saturation. Now they did all the editing and analyzing the stuff afterwards, so I'm not sure really what was used for what. It was all very close, except there were subtle differences. We also mixed back to Pro Tools digitally, A to D from the console to Pro Tools, and then as a backup, we mixed to a DSD machine, to Sonoma. Pretty much every format involved in this. It didn't sound exactly like the input, but it had a vibe I really liked. They being true to what they wanted on this album, went with analog. A little saturation, a little more warmth, and most of it came off the ATR with the high flexibility heads running at 30 amps. And as far as the analog, that was really my favorite one too. So anyways, that's about it's a little synopsis of the album there.
With budget being no issue, it really offers a lot of flexibility to get that exact sound that you really want, and to be able to compare different, small variations to most people, in the recording quality and the resolution, but to be able to hone in on exactly what you want. And they were very focused, it seems like, on exactly the sound they wanted for this album.
And also, they wanted, every time we changed reels, so there's 3 machines running, and so every time we changed reels, the tech from the studio came in and checked the alignment of the machine, not just with the meters, with a distortion analyzer, and checked every reel change was checked like that, because of just being concerned that since tape isn't very common anymore, and it wasn't common at all back in 2013, when it was 2012, 2013, when we were mixing the album. So every reel of tape was checked completely.
Wow. And it sounds like there's no distortion at all. Really, it doesn't.
There's one spot in Giorgio Moroder where the Rhodes distorts. He was playing it real hard, and everybody liked the solo. And there's a couple notes there. That's the only really bad clipping I've heard on the whole that happened on the whole album.
It's interesting going into the mix process. I'm curious, like what was achieved is definitely like a natural and classic sound that sounds modern and makes you want to move, but still, sounds classic. Obviously having that danceable feel to it was still important, right? I mean, did they give you some direction on, did they just say, do what you do, Mick? Like we trust your sound, or were they like, here's kind of what we want it to sound and feel like while retaining that dance feel?
Yeah. I mean, they were pretty specific about, the vibe they wanted and everything. And then they were involved in mixing. Since we were on an analog console, there were no recalls. They booked the whole summer in the studio to mix, and we just leave things set up until they were happy with it. So there was no going back on this album at all. I'd have input from them. If I took it too far in a direction that they didn't want to go in, which happened a couple of times, they pulled me back in. They were very focused, knew exactly what they wanted. But for the most part, it went together pretty easily. Everybody worked really well together. They had 2 engineers that work with them all the time there, that were one guy did their live sound and was very helpful, and then the other guy was their Pro Tools operator, so I didn't have to worry about at all about the organization of tracks or anything. And then plus we had a great assistant at the studio there. So everything was a magical project. It really was. It was. I mean, I've been involved in a few projects that I've felt that about, but this one was very special, and also definitely the only one I've been involved in the 21st century that had that kind of care involved in it. That was more the norm in the 80s, when the budgets were big and before everybody had home studios and everything. But this was an extreme. It was a treat to work on this record.
Also, not to mention just like the guests and collaborators that were a part of this thing too. Nile Rodgers, you mentioned Giorgio, Pharrell Williams, and Paul Williams. I mean, the list goes on and on. But wow. What an amazing group of artists that came together to do this, along with the studio personnel who lent themselves so well to the sound. So you had mentioned that you thought maybe some of this would be captured for potential surround sound, and you had some mixing in 5.1 experience, right? But what was your knowledge and experience with Dolby Atmos before the
Did Atmos
10th
even
anniversary?
exist back then, or was it it may have been just starting for movies at the time.
Yeah, exactly. It started in 2012 with the Pixar film Brave as a cinematic
we were already
experience.
trapped
Absolutely.
before Atmos started, but
right.
But I've mixed in 5.1 quite a few times, and I really liked it. So I mean, I just wanted to make sure that we could go at least some kind of surround on this.
Leading up to the 10th anniversary of this project, had you had some experience with Atmos?
No, this was my first Atmos experience. That's where Rob was a great help, because I mean, it was I knew what Atmos was, and I sort of knew how it worked, but to actually be involved in mixing in Atmos, it was Rob taught me a lot and was very helpful in that. It's mixing with objects is a little different, I think, and I try. At first I was using very few objects, and then later on I got into it a little more, and I see the advantage of it, especially if the mix is being played in a system that's bigger than 7.1.2 or 7.1.4, because you can use that virtual positioning or whatever you want to call it on the object. But really, I don't really see. I mean, I can really see the use of that for playing on big systems that have multiple height speakers. But something that isn't involved in video probably isn't going to go over 7.1.4 most of the time. So I was a little light on using the objects at first, because we were monitoring in 7.1.4, and that was the panning. At the time we mixed this, the busing in, was it in Pro Tools or the Render, that we could only go 7.1.2. So that's why one of the reasons I used a lot of quite a few objects in some songs of Daft Punk. Now I got sort of a kludgy way of doing it. I mixed a Atmos song for a Taiwanese artist over at DMI, and I set it up that I just didn't use the 0.2 tracks of 7.1.2, and the newer version of Pro Tools you can bust to 7.1.4. So I did that, and then muted those two height tracks in the bed tracks, and then routed those the four top tracks to four objects just in the corner. And because this was a song that didn't need a lot of effects, and so I just created a 7.1.4 field and panned everything within that, and I could see the advantages and the disadvantages of that. It's it seems like for playing on a most home systems or studio systems, that's going to be fine. In a movie theater, I'm sure we could have more spatial resolution.
So you went to the right place at DMI with Robert and Luca there, and a studio that masters and mixes a lot of top dance music and hip hop. Robert, can you share a little bit about your background personally and some of the work you've done and how things work at Studio DMI?
You know what's so funny? When I was listening to Mick talk about his background, it reminded me of a conversation that we had during the mixing of the record. And it was I'm very fortunate enough to have worked with a lot of great engineers. Like obviously Luca Predalesi is my mentor and stuff. But then when Mick was telling me about his time, because I was asking about the 60s and like we were just bonding over his experience and I was going about it, I had a moment where I was like, you have had such a crazy evolution of like, or just a crazy amount of projects and a crazy amount of things that have happened to you that are just so insane. And he goes, well, Rob, like, that's you right now. And I was like, that's crazy. Like, he said, like, Rob, you're there that's right awesome. Now. Yeah. And I was like, that is insane. That actually, to think about that. He's like, yeah. But, you know, okay, so for me, like, I wanted to learn how to engineer not a long time ago. I was probably like 18. I decided to go to school for audio engineering. That's where I went to school in Arizona. And then immediately outside of that was at the Conservatory of Recording Arts and Sciences. And then right after that, I ended up at Studio DMI, and I literally have never left. So from that moment on, so that was like 2019. I think the first record that I really got to work on with Luca at the time was On My Mind. And then from that moment, it was just been a ride. And then obviously, like, so I was like about 20 at the time when I started working at Studio DMI, or 21 at the time. COVID just happened. And I actually think that was the greatest thing that could have happened for my career, because we were still cranking along. Music wasn't going anywhere. People were still on their deals. So everyone was still making music, and there was nothing to do other than to make records, at least for us in the industry. So we just cranked away in the studio with zero distractions, because obviously we're in Vegas, so there's a lot of distractions. But when COVID, I know when COVID happened, everything got shut down, and there was nothing to do except for me to sit in the studio with Luca, and he just taught me so much. We spent every single day just making music, like, with zero, there was nothing else to do other than that. And then obviously from that point, I'm very fortunate to start with Atmos, because Atmos has brought so much growth for me, I feel like, personally, as an engineer, because obviously I get to do crazy things like sit with Mick Guzauski, or like, you know, we did the U2 record with Alistar, and like that whole project was just amazing. And, you know, Atmos has been such a great growing experience for me as like being a younger engineer, for sure, because now I'm at the point where I'm 26, and we started doing Atmos at like probably 2.5 years ago, right? Like 2.5, 3 years. And just that for me was like such a massive like stepping stone for not only for my career, but just as a person, because the people that I've got to meet, obviously, like working with you, Ben, and the whole team, and the things that we got to do, like going to Clear Mountain and like going to all of these things and seeing all these people, it's been such an amazing experience. And I mean, Atmos now it's great because, you know, Luca obviously does the majority of the big records that come through DMI, but because of that, and because we're doing Atmos now I also get to like step in and work on those records in a different capacity, like the Skrillex records or all of the Diplo records, or I wish we did Honestly Nevermind in Atmos, so that would have been awesome. That would have been awesome. Just a bunch of great records and great opportunities because of Atmos, and I'm very thankful for you guys.
Well, we're thankful for you. I mean, you bring the art to it, right? We make the technology, but you've accomplished a lot in a very short period of time. So congratulations on that. So Mick, how does the band or maybe it's the label approach you to do the Dolby Atmos mixes and get you hooked up with DMI? And were you given any sort of direction, like, hey, keep it as, you know, close to the original as possible?
Definitely keep it close to the original as possible. And then, but there was so much we could do that I sort of just had the idea that if it was going to just be folded back to stereo, it should be very similar to the original record, but it should have all this spatial stuff going on. And yeah, I mean, it was trying to be close to the original, but just spatially, and it just works great for Daft Punk because their music is such a combination on this record of live and their synthesized stuff, and songs like Motherboard, where stuff's flying all around and everything. That was a lot of fun. Touch, because that's like sort of that song, because there's just so many movements of it and different sections that require like almost completely different approaches. So it was from each section. So that really worked well in Atmos, I thought.
You talked a little bit about, you know, your theory around the use of beds and objects, but if we just start at the beginning of the record with Give Life Back to Music, I mean, it's maybe like one of the finest vocoder songs of the modern era, if you will. Not that the modern era encompasses too many vocoder songs, so maybe it's one of the greatest ever. But vocoders are, of course, very prominent throughout the record and throughout.
And they're all analog vocoders.
There you go. So, and which I think you did some processing on for the original recording, right? So, what's your approach to the vocoder use in Atmos?
there's not just one approach. It was the vocoders serve different purposes in different songs, and I just wanted to position them where they do something unique. I mean, it was pretty much a fly by the seat of my pants kind of thing. See, these guys didn't want anything getting out when they were doing the record, so we couldn't take rough mixes. That's one of the reasons why there was no recalls and everything, because there were no, everything stayed in the studio. So I didn't have any copies of any multi-tracks for years until we did this. So it was like rediscovering the album a lot. And I just sort of put everything together at home. Actually, that was after we started. I think when we started from the stems and the tracks, and worked with Robert, and we sort of got a procedure going. And then a lot of the stuff, I'd get the mixes ready at home just through headphones with binaural, and then we'd bring them in and work from there.
And Robert, feel free to jump in on any of these, but I'll go on to what's my personal favorite track on the record, which is Giorgio by Moroder. And you talked a little bit about the slight moment of distortion
on the road solo,
on the roads that I didn't even hear. But I have to ask about the Moog modular and the arpeggiation moments, which is just like, kind of like pure synth bliss.
Yeah.
and it sounds really amazing in Atmos, and there's some reverb going on and different things. Can you share kind of what you did there to treat that?
On those, now I can't really tell you too many specifics. I mean, if you want, I could look at the sessions and see if you want me to give you more information later. But one of the techniques was to put those sequencers in objects and move the objects and have the reverb in either separate channels or separate objects. So reverbs and delays would come from different places, give a little more spatial information.
Did you want to add something, Rob?
Listening to you guys talk about it, I'm just remembering what process was of us doing the album, and just going one by one and watching him just work. I'm just reminiscing right now on how insane that was. Just how crazy I was just work with him. And I remember when I think the last song, Mick, that you wanted to save it on purpose. It was Touch, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And he was this one might take a couple days. And he's I remember before he sat down, the session was going, he was about to go, and he turns and he looks at me, he goes, I want this one to be almost a standard. So this is going to be I remember that. And I was okay. And it was just insane. For 5 days, just I'm just thinking about all of that and how great the album is. Obviously, the album came out in 2000, what year? 2011, 13.
Yeah.
2013. I'm a kid, I'm a little kid. I'm literally in the 8th grade, maybe, or something like that. And I don't know. I'm just thinking about it, again, just thinking how insane that is and how such a beautiful album it is, and how watching him, the attention to detail and everything that Mick has and in his hands, and how much he cares about the records still, and how much he cares about the stems, just so good. And I think it conveys every time.
Yeah. It's special. It's really special. I mean, that song in particular, it's it feels like the synths are rising up and all around you. And then there's that big explosion moment in the bridge where it kind of all comes together and the vocals are kind of panning. Really, really cool. And on Motherboard too, I mean, you said you used a fair amount of objects.
Yeah, I used a lot of objects in that, a lot of panning. Things were continuously moving in that song.
Yeah. Any other comments or stories you guys want to share on specific songs? And then we can just kind of move on to a couple of closing questions.
We made stems when we were doing the album, stereo stems of everything. And then, and the Atmos mix, we had the multi-track and the stems all together. So we could take, if a stereo stem wasn't going to do what we needed, could go back to the multi-track, which we did a lot. The only thing was that we used the stems pretty much all the time was live drums, because it was just the way they were processed analog, and through the console, through compressors, through EMT plate for reverb, that we just couldn't take the basic tracks and get the same magic we did from the stereo drum track. Even though there's a lot of percussion, a lot of other stuff that is around, so you really don't notice that the drums are only in stereo in there. And then the orchestra, we went right to the multi-track because there were surround mics. There were, there was just that was just panned through all speakers. So when the orchestra comes in, it was a huge space.
It offers you a lot of flexibility when things are captured and, of course, played and recorded so well, from the very, very start. You just got such high resolution assets to work with, right? And it gives you a lot of flexibility. I was curious also about the drumless version, which came out in 2013, which, as the title implies, is a completely drumless version of the album without any percussion elements. Was there an additional pass you guys did on that, or did you just remove the drum tracks?
Just pretty much remove the drum tracks, and then there was a couple little changes, but nothing much. It was like, that was something they just wanted to do, and it was. It was important, but it was sort of more of an afterthought as far as mixing it, because we already had everything done. And just, okay, mute the drums. If it sounds good, great. If it needs some changes, we'll tweak it. So,
in closing, Robert, you shared some of the moments in the studio with Mick, and reminiscing about his career and thinking about your early days of listening to these records. What was maybe like your biggest, or a couple of your biggest takeaways, in addition to what you shared going through this process and listening to this record in Atmos and being there for the mixing of it?
Some of my biggest takeaways, I think some of my biggest takeaways is I'm very thankful, first of all, that I got to sit in there with Mick, for sure, because I don't even think he knows, but he taught me so much by just doing what he always does, and me watching and just being blown away. Even just in forms of when a record is finished, or what makes a record done, right? Or what he views as a record being done, and just watching his, I said this earlier, but his attention to detail, his care, the love, and the genuine love for it, that just blew me away every day. Because this was about a month and a half, just every day pretty much, going into the studio and being able to collaborate. And I'm actually very flattered that you said I taught you anything, because that's insane. That's crazy to me. That's crazy. I appreciate that.
I think it was a lot about how to use objects.
Yeah. Well, I remember, in the very beginning, what I do remember is that in the very beginning, it was you were definitely more conservative. And then as time went on and we kept going, then it just got you just got, obviously you got comfortable, but then the mindset and everything was just getting crazy.
It sounds like it was, although you were sitting down with a mentor who had been doing this for many years, there was an exchange of information that happened there, and there was a collaborative vibe that led to, the end result on this record. And I think that's important, because we're all always learning and sharing.
Absolutely. Literally just watching and talking to him, I'm thankful, the stories he shared, just as not only a mentor and a friend, but just how to be a professional, or how things happen in the industry, and just a lot of wisdom was passed down in passing. And I'm very appreciative of that. And it was definitely just a surreal experience for me, for sure. Learned a lot just in passing, without even him trying to teach me anything. He just taught me just by doing what he does at the highest level. And I think that's just amazing.
Thank you.
That's awesome.
You're welcome.
See, that's one of the things that make you a really good engineer too, is that people who have experience don't have to tell you. You absorb the information by being there. So it's
for sure.
That's the way I was when I was young too. It was I was lucky in that where I was from, Rochester, New York, is where the Eastman School of Music is. And it was the first school in the country in 1968 and 69 that had a recording workshop course. And Phil Ramone taught it.
Wow.
So
that's crazy.
I had that experience for 2 summers, and that was just learning so much about.
Yeah. Learn the most in the fire, man.
Yeah,
That's just the way that it is, you know?
Yeah.
We'll close with this. You mentioned that when you were working on this record, although you felt like something special was maybe happening, of course, you couldn't have known, what the impact or the end result of something like this would be. Would it be, widely accepted? Would it be, something that was amazing, but maybe, under recognized or underappreciated, but it ended up becoming, truly like a modern classic. And it's probably extraordinarily rewarding to be part of something like that. And I'm curious with, the 10th anniversary release, if it, in your mind, gives maybe a newer generation a different way to appreciate it, or a different way to connect with, the original artistic intent and the things that you did in the studio. And if so, kind of what that means.
Didn't really think of that much, but I guess it really could be. I mean, because you could do a lot more analysis of it from Atmos by separating channels and things. But I think it did add to, I think doing Atmos added to the experience of the album. I think there's so much going on in parts of that album that I think Atmos was a big improvement, a big benefit for some of those really dense parts to separate and to be in their own space. I think Atmos is a great a great advent in this industry, as long as it's used right. There's a lot of older engineers like me who I think are really excellent who say it's bullshit, but I don't agree with that at all. I think that a lot of how it's used may have been that way, but I think used correctly, it's a great tool, a great expansion of making records.
Creating an Atmos is the future, and the future is here. People are doing it today and deriving their stereo mixes from it. All right, a massive thank you to my guests, Mick Guzauski and Robert Guzman. Thank you for your time and for doing this.
Thank you.
Of course. Thank you for having us.
Many thanks to Mick and Robert for joining me for this conversation exploring Daft Punk's Random Access Memories, 10th Anniversary Edition in Dolby Atmos. It's always special to hear from the original stereo engineer on an album like this. No doubt a modern classic, now brought into Dolby Atmos with a next generation engineer like Robert and at Studio DMI. You can listen to Daft Punk's Random Access Memories, 10th Anniversary Edition, and the special Drumless Edition mixed in Dolby Atmos on enabled streaming services now. You can learn more about Robert and Luca Predalesi and Studio DMI at studiodmi.com. To hear more conversations with mix and mastering engineers and producers working in Dolby Atmos, be sure you're subscribed to Dolby Creator Talks. You can find links to our show on all the major podcasting platforms, including the video version on YouTube in our show notes, or you can simply search for Dolby wherever you get your podcasts. And if you're curious to know more about Dolby Creator Lab, head to dolbycreatorlab.com to find information about all of our programming, subscribe to our mailing list, and access the entire library of episodes of this podcast. Dolby Creator Lab is also where you'll find the Dolby Atmos Music Accelerator and Dolby Atmos Music Essentials course covering all the topics you need to get started creating content in Dolby Atmos. For other amazing Atmos resources for music creatives, check out the links in our show notes. Of course, everything is completely free and available in multiple languages. Until next time, this is Dolby Creator Talks. I'm your host, Ben Givarz. Our producer and editor is Michael Coleman. Our executive producers are Amanda Schneider and Jack Ferry, with additional editing by Matt Nixon, and our production coordinator is Karen Marroquin. Thanks for joining us.